And so pricing can be a lever for growth. But I think before you go and just jack your price to help increase your ACV, like I do think it needs to be.
Welcome to the Pricing to Win podcast. In this show, we interview pricing and competitive leaders, unpack pricing challenges, and get tactical tips for those facing similar problems today. Let's get into it.
All right, Jason, welcome to the podcast, man. Thanks so much for making time.
Thanks, Farhan. It's cool to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Absolutely. So today we want to talk all about pricing. You've had an amazing background, right? Both from early stage or mainly early stage founding PMM, as you like to call, at many different companies in many different contexts. And now you're running your own consultancy. And with each of those, as we just talked about, you have a number of different pricing challenges. So it would be helpful to maybe just kind of like zoom out for a second, and then we'll go specific to the roles. In your various functions, Sure. It's been mostly product marketing. Can you talk about like where pricing has fallen in your previous roles? Is product marketing just part of like a broader committee? Is it ultimately owned by product marketing, but you have other stakeholders involved? Can you just walk us through the permutations that you've seen?
Yeah. So like you'd mentioned, I come from, most of my career has been in early stage, anywhere kind of around that Series A startup, right? ChiliPiper, when I joined, it was like pre-Series A, Uberflip and Klue were like post-Series B, but around that like early stage still what I'd consider an early stage startup. And so I think in companies like that, a lot of times pricing is like a founder driven sort of discussion, right? I think that when you get into larger companies, it is a pretty good sign of like how much product marketing, how strategic the role is, and how much product marketing has a seat at the table. If product marketing owns pricing, like I think you see that more in larger, just in larger companies. But where I spent my time, it is typically a founder driven decision. In terms of when I say that, I mean, it's just like you have the founder coming in or the CEO or whoever, basically saying like, hey, we need to adjust our pricing, right? Or we're releasing this new product. What's our pricing going to be? They're very much involved in it. But then they bring in other stakeholders. And so in all companies I've been in, product marketing is a pretty key stakeholder there. Sales, I've come from primarily sales-led organizations. So the head of sales, like sales leadership, is heavily involved. And I think that a lot of it depends on what you're looking to price. So if it's like a brand new product, then a lot of times, yes, sales is going to be in there. Product is probably going to be involved in terms of how you price it. But you could also be looking at, the price for, added, like say, for example, you have an existing product at Uberflip. It's like, okay, well, what are incremental modules or incremental hubs going to be priced at? And then a lot of times that's more of an expansion and upsell type conversation. And so then CS gets heavily involved. So I do think that depending on what you're pricing, it's going to dictate what team is actually more heavily involved. Like who are the stakeholders at that stage? So I think that, but most cases, it's primarily like an exec level thing. Product marketing is looped in, and definitely sales is involved in the conversation. But then it changes based on, what else, like what other teams are involved. It really depends on what you're pricing, I think.
Totally. Yeah. Totally makes sense. I'd love to maybe dig into those situations of if you've ever been in a situation you're actually trying to adjust the role product marketing is playing in pricing. So let's say, product is very opinionated about how you should price or package something specific. And ultimately, at least on paper, product marketing owns the pricing. Like, what have you done in those situations where you're, getting those strong opinions from one of the stakeholders that's trying to drive in maybe a different direction? Like, what's your approach there?
So in that case there, like, is it more of we have a strong opinion on what the pricing should be or the approach should be, and we want to make sure like we're really trying to make a case for that pricing approach, or is it more of like who owns it? Like, is it just saying like, hey, product marketing needs to kind of steer this ship and own this process?
Yeah, more the latter. So if you're getting strong opinions from stakeholders, like how often do you defer effectively versus like, do you see your role more as like, okay, sure, you have the strong opinion, great, I'm really just going to help you on the execution side versus, well, no, product marketing should drive the strategy and I'll take that as an input, right? And you kind of push back there. What's your thought process on how best to approach?
Yeah, good question. And so I think, again, like the lens that I come at all of this with is startups, being in a startup, being that like small, scrappy product marketing team. I think one of the toughest things with pricing is like getting a decision made, like getting to a point where you have something to work with. So much in like a startup is like, it's just getting getting a decision made, getting pricing out there, and then learning and iterating from there. And so I think that sometimes the hardest part is when no one really has a lot of conviction on a pricing decision. And so then it's like, okay, well, how are we going to go about doing this? And because pricing decisions can just linger on and fester forever, right? And you never get to a conclusion. So if someone comes in and say they're from product, say they're from sales, and they have really strong conviction and they're like, hey, it needs to be this way because if product, like it just because I think product marketing should own that, I'm not going to come in and be like, whoa, pump the brakes. Like we need to do all this stuff and we need to go through all, like if the company can get on board with a decision around pricing, I think like that you're in a pretty good spot, especially if you're willing to treat it as a bit of a test in terms of we're going to try this pricing model, see how it works and adjust if needed. But yeah, if for some reason product marketing, and I've been in like a situation there where I don't agree with a pricing decision. Like we were about to release a product one time at one company, and the day before there was the sale, like someone on the sales team, like a sales leader had basically just said, yep, so we're going to price it at this. Like I think it was more of a packaging thing, and it hadn't been discussed at all. And we were working on the launch for it, and we just had to be like, whoa, pump the brakes. Like we are not making that pricing decision right now. We are going to put this out as is. Kind of the way we at the time decided how to do it was just to say, I basically, now that I'm trying to think through it, like basically what would happen is we were going to roll out a new feature within our product. Part of that was going to come with a pricing change. So they were like, we want to change how we package this, and let's roll it out now. Thing goes out tomorrow. Let's roll it out now. And that was like a decision that was being made by, I think it was driven primarily by sales. And we were just like, whoa, that is not the right call. We don't want to do it that way. We don't think that makes sense for XYZ reason. Let's pump the brakes. Let's actually think about this. Let's roll out the product for now without changing any pricing, and then we'll make that decision later. But that was a case where someone had, some pretty strong conviction. Like if we'd have left it to them, it would have been rolled out with that new pricing. But we had to come in and say, no, we don't agree. We want to take this approach to figuring this out. And then we had, we stepped in and made it known we didn't want to go that way. So that would be more of like a practical example of when I think product marketing needs to step in. But if someone has conviction and you're like, yeah, it seems pretty reasonable and seems like the right pricing approach, I don't think in the past I've been that motivated to come in and try to like change it or like add a bunch of steps when, hey, we all seem to be on board with this. Let's just roll with it.
Okay. Love that. So many good nuggets in there. I took a couple of notes. One, I think it's an important call out that like a worse solution is when or a worse situation is when no one has conviction, right? You're just kind of going round and round, right? It's actually helpful when someone at least has strong conviction, but now it's more about, well, what's the right thing for the business in that moment, right? If the business is on board with this decision, let's just roll it. It doesn't really matter kind of who it's coming from. I also like that you talked about this concept of deconstructing pricing, similar to like launch, right? In PMM land, there's always this talk about, well, code complete is not launch, right? Those need to be fundamentally separate for a lot of different reasons. Similarly, right, you can roll out your product. Your pricing doesn't necessarily have to be attached to that as well if you need more time in the situation that you described, right? If you don't feel like you really have that conviction, you can also just punt that decision for future. I think it makes a ton of sense. Super helpful.
Yeah.
What is, like, when you think about some of the pricing challenges you faced, whether it's at Uberflip, your current role, whatever it might be, what would you say is like one pricing experience you always come back to as like, man, this is like a key principle that I just need to have always going forward?
I don't know if I would have a necessarily like a key principle around pricing. I think that, maybe if anything, the one thing I've learned is that, I've just been involved in is like, I know pricing is a growth lever. So if like your company has growth goals, and this, you often see this in venture-backed startups where it's like, hey, we have aggressive growth goals. We need to hit those targets. And so pricing can be a lever for growth. But I think before you go and just jack your price to help increase your ACV, like I do think it needs to be, that can't be it's tough when that's the only reason that you're doing it, is to just increase ACV. And I think that you need to be bringing more value to the product. Like there needs to be another reason for the customer, because if you're going to change your price, you're going to increase your price. Ultimately, the customer expects more value, right? And especially if you're increasing for existing customers, which I've had to be like, I've been involved in that process before, and it's challenging, right? You have to be okay with like a certain amount of churn and customers, right? But it's easier to do if you are pairing that with, hey, here's a incremental value. Here is this, we've added so much in the last 6 months or in the last year to the product, and now we are, we're changing our price. I feel like Netflix increases my price every other week, but it doesn't seem like the content's getting that much better, right? So it's, I think that would be one of those things when in the future, working with a SaaS company that's trying to increase price, it's really trying to understand, like, especially around a price increase, why, what's the rationale for this? How are we going to explain this to the customer? But I've been in like a few other challenging situations around price before. And I think there's like different scenarios you can get in that are challenging. Where, I dealt with like a few different scenarios that we were trying to change price, create new pricing. And it's like I could share a couple of those. Maybe we can, I'm sure you've probably been in a couple too, and we can like commiserate over those. Because I'll just like, there's 3 scenarios that I've been in that have been challenging with pricing. And maybe you've been in one of these, and we can just chat about it. But one is like adding a new product that is going to change how you price your product. So like, for example, and a new product might just be a new feature, adding new functionality, adding something new that's going to change your pricing model. And so when I was at Uberflip, for example, Uberflip was primarily, pricing was pretty straightforward. There was a platform fee, and then I think that it was basically a few different tiers. And based on that, it was unlimited users, and it was more around usage. So the number of hubs, the number of streams, which is all related to how much content, how many different experiences we're building, things like that. But then, and with that, we had a certain pricing model that worked for all that. Then we added something called sales streams, which was then we started to target sales teams with saying, hey, here's a sales product where you can start to build out, share collections of content with prospects and stuff. And so that actually changed. It was a pretty big change to the pricing model, because now we were doing like sales licenses, and we were starting to do user-based pricing. And so that was definitely a challenge there, where you had to start to say, okay, now you're essentially adding complexity to your pricing, and which has been challenging. And I've dealt with that at multiple companies, where now you're going in, providing a customer with a quote, giving them pricing. There's much more layers to it. And I've always found, like, when I've had to deal with that, it has been a challenge, because the enablement piece almost becomes one of the most challenging parts of it. So that's one thing. Another one is new products that you just simply don't know how to price. So AI today is a perfect example of that. People just aren't sure how to price it. And so I remember even back as far as, again, Uberflip, and we had Uberflip AI at the time. And I remember at first we tried to do it as like a percentage increase to your contract. And I remember that did not go well because people just didn't know the value of this product. They didn't get the percentage increase. And we just didn't know how to price that product, because it was a new product. There wasn't a lot of precedent set. It was really, it was hard. And then the third one that we dealt with was breaking products apart. So how do you take something that's more so like a one more simple pricing, right? Like how is it something that's just you come in and you kind of pay, whether it's a platform fee and a user fee, but then you start to split out your products and you start to say, hey, this is going to be, there's a platform fee for this and a user license for this, and then a user license for that separately. And people typically need multiple things. And again, creates that complexity. So like those were a couple of the situations that I've been in the past that were like challenging pricing, decisions to make, right?
So much to unpack there. As I take a couple of notes, like one thing that's clear to me that you also mentioned when you're talking about the growth lever is there's kind of two things. One is it's got to be defensible, right? If you can't defend your price to a customer, fundamentally your pricing model is incorrect, right? In your Uber AI example or Uberflip AI, where it's just a percentage increase and people are like, what the hell is it? How do I back into this number, right? I need to be able to defend, or and then maybe the second component of that, both to customers and internally, is it needs to be easily explainable as well. I personally don't think complexity is a bad thing. I'm curious on your take there. But if your complexity is easily explainable, either internally, right, getting everyone on the same page with lots of different reps from different experience, blah, 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 but also to customers, right, and the various stakeholders, whether it's your user, champion, CFO, CEO, whoever it might be, right? If everybody is defensible and explainable, then to me, I feel like it's fine, right? That complexity is fine. Now, it's overhead internally.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like I think the complexity thing is definitely something that most companies I've been at, sales-led organizations, sales enablement, a big part. And when the pricing becomes complex, most of the complaining you get is from the sales team, where they feel like it's hard to explain, and you will get deals where a buyer says that the pricing is confusing. And sometimes I think people latch onto that and maybe make it bigger than it actually is. But I totally agree with you. There's a difference between complex pricing and buyers being confused by your pricing.
Yes.
Because you can have complex pricing, like you can have multi-layer, like multiple variables and stuff in your pricing model, but you can explain it in a way that's easy for someone to understand, right? Like, Atlassian, like these companies that have, like HubSpot, for example, they have pretty complex. And when I say complex, there's just all these different levers. So pricing can seem complex, but they use a simple calculator to make it pretty easy for people to understand. Or another thing too is how you explain, like a sales rep might explain pricing to someone. If you just are taking a consultative approach and a sales rep comes in and they're trying to understand the needs of your business, they can just come in and give you a quote. And then they can break it down afterwards if you need it and kind of show you how they came to that quote. But it's not like you need to throw all of your pricing options at them at once and say, hey, like figure it out. You could basically take the consultative approach and just say, hey, here's based on what we talked about, I think you need this, and this, and this is what the pricing is going to be. So I agree with you there. Yeah, I agree with that.
This is super interesting. Now, I love how you're thinking about all these different vectors, right? So a couple of examples that you mentioned is, okay, when you have increased complexity, there are a couple of tactical things that you can do. One, on your website, right? From the jump, you can start to incorporate things like calculators to help people understand what different bundles go together, right? And maybe there's some increased incentives for putting specific bundles together. All that can be done completely self-serve via calculator. The other is if you have a sales-led motion, and then your salesperson, right, can start to take this consultative approach where they at least start with something, and then based on customers' needs, now we have additional tailoring, blah, blah, blah. I'm curious on if you have thoughts around the other aspect, which is like if you don't have a salesperson involved, right? And one is maybe like scaring people away from your website and just like that perceived complexity. But then if you want to go more towards a self-serve motion, how much of that do you have current experience with, or at least thoughts on like how your pricing tactics should change?
I think I have less experience with product-led products, right? But coming from like ChiliPiper was a big advocate to putting pricing on your website. Right. And so, and ChiliPiper has multiple products, right? Like you're getting into that thing where to some people, the pricing, if you're looking at multiple products, and it could be a thing where it seems complex, But we went through multiple kind of iterations of the pricing page to try and simplify it as much as possible, right? And I do think that I love the idea of calculators. I love the idea of, on some sites you'll see it where even from like a packaging perspective, they'll just highlight the main differentiators of the package. And they've always got that like see more features, right? Where you can dig down further if you want to. But the main thing is to get there and to quickly understand what tier is right for me, right? What package is right for me, and what are the main differences, right? What am I getting here that I won't get in the lower plan, or I'm missing out on if I don't get the higher plan? But yeah, I'm a big fan of, I love putting pricing on the website. I try to do that. Like I take that approach with all of my products. Like there are some people who have coaching programs or things like that, and they don't put pricing out there so you can see it. And I just know, like, I put it out there. I put it on the website so that when I do hop on an inquiry call with someone for my coaching, I'm just like, I'm assuming when I get to the pricing page, there's never any question. I'm always just like, I'm assuming you book this call, you've been on the pricing page, you've seen the pricing, and they're always like, yeah. So it's just, then you don't have to unveil it. There's no like, oh no, I can't work with that at all, right? So I just feel like it's a helpful qualifier too. But yes, to answer your question, I think when it comes to a product led, not needing to involve a sales team, I think that one, put pricing on your website, obviously. But two, if you can make it easier, what can you do to make it easier for people to grasp what the pricing is, quickly understand it, but also help find the right plan for them? It shouldn't just be a fancy calculator where you can like move the dials. It should be, the best sites are the ones that help people spot that, oh yeah, that's where I need to be.
Perfect. Whether that's by persona or, writing out maybe more targeted messaging, et cetera, making it clear, right? Ultimately.
A cool example that I'd seen, I forget who did it. But on their different tiers, they had logos of companies who used that tier. So a little bit of social proof, but it was also, if you went there, you could be like, okay, well, we're around that same size. This is our type of company. So that's probably the better plan that we should go with.
Yeah. I love that. That's a super smart idea. You also like pricing on the website is something I want to come back to, especially maybe like talking about pros, cons for your coaching program. But before that, you mentioned ChiliPiper. I'd like to dig in a little bit more there. ChiliPiper is, in my opinion, well known for this like very firm no discounting policy, right? And that comes directly from the founders, very public about it, mentioned multiple times on the website, on the blog, and public talks, blah blah blah. I'm curious, like when you talked about like going through multiple iterations of the pricing page, like number one, I'm assuming that no discounts was like omnipresent. So if you can like speak to a little bit about that, obviously that's founder led, but just thinking about like what are some of the ways you operationalize that, and I'd love if you could also give us a TLDR of like what were some of those pricing changes that you walked through at ChiliPiper, kind of what drove those and kind of what was the from to.
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, we'll start with the no discounts. It was from day one, just an ingrained, just that it was a business decision, but it's also just part of their like ethos, like their POV as a company. They often referred to ChiliPiper, especially in the early days, as buyer enablement, right? Like it was how do you make buying easier for your prospects? They don't want to wait around for a demo. They don't want to, right? How do you make it as quick and easy as possible to get someone who wants to see your product in to see it and have a meeting? And so they were also huge advocates for putting pricing on the website, which is why they always had pricing on the website, right? They never tried to hide it. And same thing with discounting. It was everyone, we want it to be very clear what our pricing is. We don't want to get bogged down in these sales conversations around discounting and right, having customer, like having all of these like more complexity in the sales process because people are trying to come in and negotiate price. Like let's just make it super simple. Everyone's on the same playing field. We feel like our product is worth what we're charging for it. So it's no question of value. Like we're charging a fair price for a good product. And let's not make it more complicated than it needs to be. So it is what it is. That what you see is what you get. And they stood by that from day one. And I haven't heard any difference since, even since I haven't been there. And it adds challenges, but a lot of times it makes things a lot more simple too. Makes it simple for the customer, but it also makes it simple for the company in many ways, right? And the sales team in many ways. Right? And so it wasn't. Yeah, it's hard to say that there was like some sort of strategy to it, right? It was just a hard decision from day one. That was their stance, and it never changed. Yeah.
I'm curious, and like you touched on a number of benefits of this policy. When they explained the rationale, maybe even internally or externally, whatever it may be, was there one particular driver of, like, for example, sales complexity, right? We want to reduce sales cycles. This takes way too long, so we just don't want to touch it at all. Versus maybe the simplicity for the customer, right? We want to make it as easy as possible to understand. Easiest way is what you see is what you get, right? There is no distinction. Like, is there kind of one driver you would say?
I think it was just the remove complexity, both in their opinion, both for the buyer and for our team. It was, they just weren't big fans of a sales process that came down to a pricing negotiation, a discount, right? It just, they felt their product was worth what they were charging for it. So let's not, the price is fair, right? It's a low price in their opinion, right? It's like a very like fair price. And let's just, we want you to buy it because it's worth it, not because we're giving you some sort of discount. And they also didn't, for them, when you start to bring in discounts too, it just changes the sales when all your revenue comes in, right? Like, so at ChiliPiper, you would find that deals come in mid-month, beginning of the month, end of the month. It really didn't matter, right? Because no one was motivated by some deadline to hit a discount at the end of a month, the quarter, or whatever. So you'd have deals come in whenever they were ready to come in. And so again, that causes challenges because a sales rep has no motivator, right? You're trying to find motivators. But it's also good because no company is saying, oh, we're holding out. We know if we wait till the end of the quarter, we're going to get a discount, because it won't happen.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure the counter of that is also true. I'm curious if you can speak about that, of like, as you go into the enterprise world and you have departments like procurement that are involved, where it's literally their job. It's literally how they're called in order to get a discount, right? And so I'm curious of, like, some customers may be not willing to even work with you, right, with this no discount policy, which would cause obviously internal friction, missing out on logos, potentially going to the competitor. Like, how did that play out? And I guess more specifically, like, how did the competition kind of play as an input? Were competitors like weaponizing this against you? And how often did you kind of think about that as an input?
Yeah, there were deals we had to walk away from pretty often, right? And your procurement teams, right? Exactly. So you had procurement teams who would come in and they would just, their whole thing was, I need to get a discount. Like, I need something, right? That conversation happened it happened all the time. And I think that those were tough conversations, and it's just one of those things where you needed to be willing to walk away. And ChiliPiper was, in a lot of cases, just like willing to just stand firm on this thing where, hey, like, we're not giving discounts to anybody. It'd be unfair if we like came in and gave you a discount, right? That's not how we work. And so, yeah, you would have some people who are like, they just don't buy it. They're like, really? Like, you're not going to give us a discount? And it was, and so I think that's why, as a company, they need to talk about it publicly, so that there's no, like, they can just be like, listen, this is just our policy. Like, we don't do it. And so if that's going to be an issue, and they would bring up early, like, they weren't afraid to show pricing. It was on the website. They didn't mind quoting people early and just saying, that's our price. Like, if you have a problem and that's not going to be, and we don't discount, if that's going to be a problem, then we might as well not continue. Right. But yeah, it was interesting. And what was your second question there?
Around competition. So, like, how does competition play into this, of like, where competitors, I'm assuming competitors were not following this policy. So, like, if you find that competitors are now like offering discounts and you're receiving pricing pressure, or competitors like even weaponizing this like against you, what was that feedback or kind of internal dialogue on like, well, where does the competitive landscape play as an input into how you price, if at all?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like competitors factor into price all the time. Like I think like if anyone says competition doesn't affect their pricing, I think, I don't know, most times they're not telling the truth. Like I think that you price your product relative, like there's so much that like when people look for a product and within a certain category of product, there are a lot of expectations that come with that. So even if you might not be thinking about a specific competitor, you're thinking about the other alternatives on the market, and you're thinking about how are things typically priced in this, and do we want to go with a typical model people are used to, like whether it be usage based or like user based and those sorts of things, and that's all based on how other things in that market are priced. Or do you want to go against that and price it completely different and differentiate in some way? Again, that's also a decision you're making deliberately based on what competition is doing. So I don't think that it's ever it's not like you are totally oblivious to what's going on with competitors when you're setting your price, unless you are doing a brand new, never seen before product, which like could happen. And then you've got to come up with, you've got to come up with it on your own in terms of how you price. But even then you're kind of looking to like adjacent industries or similar type things, at least for a starting point. But in the case of ChiliPiper, when like were competitors trying to take advantage of that, I just think it was one of those things where as a company, if you know ChiliPiper doesn't discount, then you know if you discount and ChiliPiper puts their pricing out there, right? It just makes it easier for people to undercut on price, right? And it's just going to happen. So I do think you would see competitors come in and say, well, we know what they price, so we're going to charge less. And that's it. There's nothing they can really do about it. And so in those cases, it's challenging. Luckily for ChiliPiper, they have a very differentiated, like competitive product. So it was always one of those things where you could be confident in knowing that, hey, our product is worth it. It's also one of those products where the ROI of it was so clear. So you could say, you come in, here's the price. You plug in ChiliPiper, your conversion rate's going to go up, and it's very clear. The ROI for them is very clear. And so a lot of times sure, they might have competitors who are, slightly cheaper or something like that, but the ROI was there, and it wasn't that they couldn't make a business case to buy ChiliPiper. So pricing was never, I don't think we lost a lot of deals to competitors necessarily because of price, right? When I was there and we were working on price, right? So it was
super helpful. All right, I took a bunch of notes again, just to like recap a couple of things. I love that, like, number one, competition is always an input into price, or at least should be, if you've done your pricing well. Yeah. That kind of theme around easily understood, like, also came back here. I think another important nuance that you called out is the ROI was super clear for ChiliPiper. So you actually, a lot of times when people don't have clear ROI is when they're using price, right, as a disrupting factor, because their product is more or less the same, right? So they're trying to differentiate on this price factor. But in ChiliPiper's case, right, as any pricing model is not perfect, you have some benefits on easily understood for the customer, less complexity, faster sales cycles. But on the other side, right, the fact that, you would get undercut by price from competitors, or at least it was very easy for them to do so. You just have to kind of expect that. And that's the con for all those other trade-offs. And that's just ultimately a business decision. Is it worth it?
And it is one of those things where, if you're going to make that move as a company where you never discount and your pricing is out there for everyone to see, you better make sure that your product is continuously improved. Like, you always have to make sure that you are differentiating your product. Otherwise, if you just stay stagnant and you never innovate, like you never change, and you let competitors come up and copy you and outpace you, then you're in a bad situation. Totally.
All right, let's talk a little bit about pricing on the website that you had mentioned, and we could talk a little bit about your consultancy here, and then we'll move on to our like rapid fire, just kind of a few quick questions. On your consultancy, I'm curious, like, pricing on the website, there's always this debate, right? The pro is, like you said, want people to be educated up front. It's a qualifier. It also doesn't need to be this like big shocking thing. Now, the downside to that is someone might disqualify and like you have no idea why. Like at least in your case, you mentioned you got the feedback that, hey, you actually might be pricing much lower, and that was great. But maybe potentially there's other folks who like you don't understand like who that target segment is because there's all these conversations you're not potentially having. So when you were thinking about maybe on a coaching standpoint, right? It sounds like you also did some competitive research to see what other people did. Like, what was your kind of mental model like, and how did that change throughout your offering?
Yeah, when I was first like trying to figure out pricing for my coaching offering, like I totally looked at what else was out there. How are people typically pricing these things, and packaging too? Like what is typically offered in these types of coaching programs, and that's where I came up with like a price, right? And for me, when I'm getting started, it's interesting. I talked to a founder one time who had a very different service. Like he runs an agency, a bit of a productized service. And I remember his advice to me, which, I take this advice as a solopreneur, someone who I just, I make the decision on my price. I can change it tomorrow. It's very easy for me to do. Right. Like it's obviously it's not saying I'm going to change my pricing tomorrow, but it's something where I get to make those calls. And I find people who are in a position like mine, they can experiment with things and try things and change. But his thing was, early on, you just want to get customers. You want to validate that the service is valuable. You want to make sure that you are you're figuring out your processes and a system for how you want to deliver this thing. So you just want customers to start, right? And so don't outprice yourself early. It's easier to increase your price than it is to decrease it, which I believe is very true. Right? It's hard, especially when you have people who are paying good money to use your service or purchase your product, and then to go and find out 6 months later everyone else is getting it for cheaper or half the price or whatever. It's hard to do. Versus increasing, it's a very easy story to tell. I mean, improve the value of this. I'm realizing it's more valuable. I'm increasing the price, and it's a motivator for people it can be a good motivator. You see it all the time. And so he was like, start like lower than you think you need to. It's going to give you an opportunity to get customers. And then it's easy to increase your price later. And so that's kind of been my mentality when I've been starting. And I think the challenge that I'm having is just, figuring out what's too low, like where it's almost like a value signal where, maybe it's too low, right? Because that can happen too. And so, I think like that's one of the challenging things of figuring out how to price something. And it's also who you sell to. So if you're going in and you're selling, say, advisory services to like a CMO or a founder or something, for them, budgets are much higher than if you're, say, trying to sell a coaching program to a product marketer who hopefully wants to try and expense it. But then also a lot of times, they're paying for their own professional development. And so it's, who you sell to, the ICP and like your target market here makes a big difference too. So those are things that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And also just, do you need to increase your price, or can you adjust what comes with what your service is without having to increase price, but maybe find ways to scale it, create processes, like productize it in a way where it's taking less of your personal time. And so you can keep your price while increasing your profit margin or spending less time on it. While at the same time, a lot of times you can increase the value too. Like a simple thing could be group coaching versus individual coaching, right? For a portion of the service, right? A lot of people find group coaching more valuable. So those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about.
Super helpful. So I looked up your price while we were chatting. I'm just super curious, right? Starting at $2,000 for 4 months of this coaching program. I'm curious, oftentimes step 0 is the hardest part of like just landing on like something, right? And then obviously, like you mentioned, you can iterate. What was your process for like, how did you just choose 2,000? Where did that initially come from?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like originally I had started, like when I started this service, I just put up a simple landing page on Notion and I started pitching it to some of like founders that I knew. And at the time, I think I had something around, it was like $1,000 a month, and I would meet with them once a week, right? And so it's relatively low, right? Like it's not a high price for an hour of coaching. And I've evolved it over time, and I've tried, I've experimented with a couple of things. There was a point in time when I did kind of adjust the number of calls you got, and so it was a little bit higher, and got some feedback, right? From some people who said that, and there was also a point where I reduced the number of calls, but I added this idea of asynchronous support, and this idea of, hey, like if you need someone that you can ping offline and get feedback on things, and started to say, okay, well, is there more value to this, and maybe less one-on-one time and more asynchronous support? And again, I was just kind of experimenting with those things and adjusting it and getting feedback as you go. And the good thing about keeping it like low enough where it's not, the price of it is not a huge barrier to entry, is that at least I'm able to get feedback, like that sort of feedback from people who are actually putting up money. It's one thing to ask them in a survey what you're willing to pay. And when I did the Productivity Hub, for example, I did like a Van Westendorp study. So sent a survey out to people, and you get, that's kind of how I gauged where I wanted to put my price. But at the end of the day, you don't really know until you put a paywall in front of someone and you say, hey, put your credit card in and pay. And so that's why it's, by having customers and working with product marketers and starting to really see, what they're willing to pay, what they find valuable in the program, right? And now just asking questions to people of like, hey, what would you think of group coaching versus individual coaching? Would that be more or less valuable to you? And yeah, I really don't think I know until I just say, here's what it costs. Are you ready to, like, do you want to sign up?
Yeah. So much there, as always. Jason, this has been super, super insightful. And I'll just plug for you. I've seen when you went through your Van Westendorp study, you also put out a template for others to replicate it themselves. I downloaded that. I think it was very well done, very easily explainable and repeatable for others, which all good templates are, and many of your others are. And so thank you so much for that, man. This has been super, super insightful. Last 30 seconds, any resources that have been helpful for you in your pricing journey that you want to shout for others? And then if someone wants to follow up with you, where would you recommend they go?
Learning pricing for me, I always remember Price Intelligently. I think they're still that name now, right? They were Profitwell, and then they got acquired. But their blog content was always really good. Patrick Campbell, I think, was the founder. Yeah, so their blog content was always great. Really good content on pricing. Tamara, who's my one of my co-captains on Ready for Launch, both the podcast and the course. So she has a pricing certified course with PMA, and I know I've learned a lot from Tamara on pricing. So definitely check that out too if you're looking to do like a deep dive there. And then if you want to even understand price as part of a broader like launch strategy, there's a segment dedicated to price as part of our cohort based course. So check that out as well. It's called Ready for Launch. I would say two people I like to follow and they share cool content on pricing on LinkedIn is, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing their names right, but it is Karen Sood. So Karan Sood and John Katowski. Both of them just share really cool pricing examples. They talk about pricing tests that they're seeing companies do. So I see some cool examples from them. And yeah, if anyone wants to chat with me, I'd say connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, or go to productivepmm.com. All
right. Karen Sood, John Katowski, Productive PMM, Ready for Launch. We'll link all these in the show notes so people can find them. Amazing. Congrats on the cohort. Congrats on the consultancy. And thank you so much again for taking the time.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Pricing to Win podcast. Remember to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.